Hey everyone, welcome back to Great American Classics. I'm Bill, and today we're diving into something that honestly changed everything about the air war in World War II. Now, if you've ever heard somebody mention the P-51 Mustang, you probably know it's one of the most celebrated aircraft in American history. But what you might not know is just how close it came to being something completely forgettable, and how the Germans, at least early on, really did underestimate what this plane could do. The title says it all. German pilots laughed at the P-51 Mustangs until it shot down 5,000 German planes, and while that number sounds almost too big to be real, it's pretty close to the truth. The actual confirmed air-to-air kills credited to P-51 pilots in the European theater came in just under 5,000. Somewhere around 4,950 depending on which records you look at. But either way, we're talking about a staggering number that completely reshaped the war in the skies over Europe. So let's go back and look at how this all happened, because honestly, the story of the Mustang is one of those cases where everything had to go exactly right. And a few key decisions by people who really believed in this airplane ended up saving thousands of American lives and helping win the war. So, to understand why the P-51 mattered so much, you really have to understand what the situation was like before it showed up. In 1942 and into 1943, the United States Army Air Forces, what we'd eventually just call the Air Force, was trying to prove a theory that a lot of people had serious doubts about. The idea was that heavy bombers, flying in tight formations with overlapping fields of fire from their defensive guns, could penetrate deep into enemy territory in broad daylight and bomb strategic targets, things like ball-bearing factories, oil refineries, aircraft plants, and railroad yards. The thinking was that if you hit these targets hard enough and often enough, you could cripple Germany's ability to make war. And on paper, it made sense. The B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator were tough aircraft, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns, and American planners believed that a tight combat box formation could defend itself against enemy fighters. The British had already tried daylight bombing earlier in the war and taken horrific losses, so they switched to night bombing, which was less accurate but a lot safer for the crews. The Americans, though, were convinced they could make daylight precision bombing work, and for a while it kind of did, at least on shorter missions where fighter escort was available. But the problem was the fighters. In 1942 and early 1943, the main American fighters in Europe were the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning. Now don't get me wrong, those were excellent aircraft in their own right. The P-47 was this big, powerful, rugged machine that could take incredible punishment and still bring its pilot home. And the P-38 was fast and had great range for its time. Plus, that distinctive twin-boom design made it instantly recognizable. But neither of them could go all the way to the targets deep inside Germany and back. They just didn't have the range. So, what would happen is the bombers would take off from England. The fighters would escort them part way, maybe a couple hundred miles into occupied Europe, and then the fighters would have to turn back because they were running low on fuel. And that's when the German fighters would hit. The Luftwaffe figured this out pretty quickly. They knew exactly how far American fighters could go, and they'd wait, just out of range, circling and watching. And the moment those P-47s turned around, the German fighters would come in like wolves on a wounded animal. The Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt 109, those were formidable opponents, flown by pilots who had years of combat experience, many of them veterans of the Battle of Britain, the Eastern Front, North Africa. These weren't amateurs, and the American bomber crews, as brave as they were, found themselves flying hundreds of miles into the heart of Nazi Germany, with no protection, The losses were catastrophic. The mission that really drove this home was the raid on Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943. Schweinfurt was where Germany manufactured most of its ball bearings, which were absolutely essential for everything from tanks to aircraft to submarines. Knock out Schweinfurt, and you'd cripple German industry. At least, that was the theory. The 8th Air Force sent 291 B-17s on that mission. The fighter escort had to turn back after about an hour, and for the rest of the way, those bombers were on their own. The Luftwaffe hit them with everything they had. By the time it was over, 60 B-17s had been shot down. That's 600 men killed or captured in a single afternoon. Another 17 bombers were damaged so badly they never flew again. More than 100 others came back with significant damage. The 8th Air Force had lost more than a quarter of its attacking force in one mission. That's not sustainable. You can't keep doing that. And there were serious discussions at the highest levels about whether the entire daylight bombing campaign should be abandoned. This is the context you have to keep in mind when we talk about the P-51 Mustang. The Americans desperately needed a fighter that could go all the way to Berlin and back, stay with the bombers the whole way, and still have enough fuel and performance to fight the Luftwaffe. And here's the thing, that fighter already existed, sort of. It just needed the right engine. The P-51 was originally designed by North American Aviation back in 1940. And honestly, it almost happened by accident. The British were in desperate need of fighter aircraft early in the war, and they approached North American about building P-40 Warhawks under license. North American came back with a counter-proposal. They said, "Give us 120 days, and we'll design you a brand new fighter from scratch, one that's better than the P-40. It was a bold promise, but North American delivered. They had a prototype ready in just 102 days. The design was sleek, modern, and incorporated some innovations that would prove crucial, including a laminar flow wing that reduced drag and gave the aircraft excellent speed and range. The British called it the Mustang, and they started using it in 1942, mostly for ground attack and reconnaissance work. And it was good at that. Really good, actually, but there was a problem. The early Mustangs used the Allison V1710 engine, which was a solid power plant at low altitudes, but its performance dropped off badly above about 15,000 feet, and that's exactly where the air war over Europe was being fought. The bombers flew at 25,000 feet or higher, and that's where the German fighters intercepted them. A low-altitude fighter wasn't going to cut it. Now, here's where it gets interesting. A British test pilot named Ronald Harker flew the Mustang and was impressed by its handling and its speed at low altitude. He started wondering what would happen if you put a better engine in it, specifically the Rolls-Royce Merlin, which was the same engine that powered the Spitfire and the Lancaster bomber. The Merlin was a supercharged engine that actually got better at high altitude, exactly the opposite of the Allison. Harker pushed this idea up the chain, and eventually, the conversion was tried. They took a Mustang airframe, ripped out the Allison, and installed a Merlin. The results were, well, transformative is probably the right word. With the Merlin engine, the P-51 became a completely different airplane. Its top speed jumped to around 440 miles per hour at high altitude, making it one of the fastest propeller-driven fighters of the war. Its ceiling went up to over 40,000 feet, and critically, its range, which was already good, became extraordinary when combined with external drop tanks. A P-51 with drop tanks could fly over 1,700 miles, enough to escort bombers from England to Berlin, fight over the target, and make it back home. Nothing else could do that. The P-47 couldn't, the P-38 couldn't, only the Mustang. The American version with the Merlin engine was designated the P-51B, and it started arriving in England in late 1943. The first unit to fly them in combat was the 354th Fighter Group, which flew its first escort mission in December of 1943. And almost immediately, things started to change. Not overnight, and not without growing pains, because the early Merlin Mustangs had some mechanical issues that needed to be worked out, and pilots had to learn how to get the most out of the aircraft. But by early 1944, the P-51s were going all the way to Berlin with the bombers, and the Luftwaffe suddenly had a serious problem. See, the German pilots had gotten used to a certain rhythm of combat. They knew when the American fighters would turn back. They knew how long they'd have to attack the bombers without interference. And they'd developed tactics based on that knowledge. Head-on attacks through the bomber formations, diving passes from above, hit and run. It worked because they had time and space to operate. But now, suddenly, there were American fighters showing up where they had no business being. Over Bremen, over Hanover, over Berlin itself. German pilots later described the shock of seeing those distinctive checkered noses and invasion stripes hundreds of miles inside the Reich, where no American fighter had ever been before. Adolf Galland, who was one of the most famous German fighter aces, and who commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter forces for much of the war, later said something that gets quoted a lot in histories of the air war. When asked by Hermann Göring what he needed to win the air battle, Galland supposedly replied that he needed a squadron of Spitfires, which was kind of a backhanded insult at the state of German fighter development. But there's another quote attributed to Galland that's probably more significant. He said that the day he saw American fighters over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. Now, I should be careful here, because quotes like this get repeated so often that they sometimes get distorted or taken out of context. But the sentiment was real. The appearance of long-range American escort fighters was a strategic catastrophe for Germany, and German commanders knew it. Here's why it mattered so much. The Luftwaffe's entire defensive strategy was based on attriting the American bomber force faster than it could be replaced. If they could shoot down enough bombers, kill or capture enough crews, eventually, the Americans would have to stop. But that calculus depended on being able to attack the bombers without interference for most of the mission. Once the P-51s started providing escort all the way to the target and back, the German fighters had to fight their way through the escorts before they could even get to the bombers. And that meant taking losses, heavy losses, losses they couldn't afford. Germany in 1944 was already running short of everything: fuel, aluminum, trained pilots. The Luftwaffe could still produce aircraft. They actually increased fighter production in 1944, but they couldn't produce experienced pilots fast enough to replace the ones they were losing. And the American strategy shifted in a way that made this even worse. Starting in early 1944, the escort fighters were given more freedom to hunt. Instead of staying close to the bombers at all times, they were allowed to pursue enemy aircraft, strafe airfields, attack targets of opportunity. The idea was to destroy the Luftwaffe not just in the air, but on the ground, in the factories, in the training schools. It was a war of attrition, and America had more resources to throw into that war than Germany did. The P-51 was central to this strategy because it could do things other fighters couldn't. It could escort bombers deep into Germany, fight off enemy interceptors, and still have enough fuel to strafe an airfield on the way home. It was fast enough to catch almost anything the Germans were flying, maneuverable enough to dogfight effectively, and reliable enough to operate day after day in harsh conditions. And it was being produced in enormous numbers. By the end of the war, North American had built more than 15,000 Mustangs, and they were everywhere. In Europe, in the Pacific, in the Mediterranean. Let me tell you about some of the men who flew these aircraft, because ultimately, the airplane was just a tool. It was the pilots who made it effective, and some of them achieved records that still seem almost unbelievable. George Preddy was probably the highest-scoring Mustang ace of the war, with around 27 victories in the P-51. He was from Greensboro, North Carolina, and he had this calm, methodical approach to air combat that made him incredibly effective. Preddy could read a dogfight, anticipate what the enemy was going to do, and put himself in position to take the shot. On August 6, 1944, he shot down 6 German aircraft in a single mission, which was one of the highest single-day totals of any American pilot in the European theater. Tragically, Preddy was killed on Christmas Day 1944, shot down by friendly anti-aircraft fire during the Battle of the Bulge. He was only 25 years old. Then there was Don Gentile, who some considered the best natural pilot in the 8th Air Force. Gentile was an Italian-American from Ohio, and he had actually volunteered to fly with the Royal Air Force before Pearl Harbor. So, by the time he got into a P-51, he already had combat experience in Spitfires. He was aggressive, maybe sometimes too aggressive, but he got results. His wingman was a guy named John Godfrey, and together they formed one of the most successful pilot teams of the war. Gentile ended up with around 22 victories before he was rotated home for publicity tours. Bud Anderson was another one, from Newcastle, California. He flew the P-51 with the 357th Fighter Group, and he had this remarkable streak of never being seriously hit by enemy fire. Over his entire combat tour, he was never shot down, never even had to make an emergency landing due to battle damage. He attributed it to a combination of good flying, good luck, and always keeping his head on a swivel. Anderson ended up with 16¼ victories, and he survived the war, living well into his 90s and becoming a beloved figure in the aviation community. Chuck Yeager, who would later become famous as the first person to break the sound barrier, was a P-51 pilot in the war. He flew with the 363rd Fighter Group, and on October 12, 1944, he shot down 5 German aircraft in a single day, becoming an ace in one mission. Earlier in the war, Yeager had been shot down over France and evaded capture with the help of the French resistance, eventually making it back to England and returning to combat. His skills as a pilot were obvious even then, and the Mustang gave him the platform to demonstrate what he could do. These are just a few names, and there were hundreds of others. The statistics tell part of the story. P-51 pilots in the European theater were credited with destroying approximately 4,900 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. That's more than any other American fighter type. They also destroyed more than 4,000 aircraft on the ground during strafing attacks, which was arguably just as important because every plane destroyed on the ground was one that wouldn't be taking off to intercept the bombers. Now, I want to circle back to the idea that German pilots laughed at the P-51 because that's in the title, and there's some truth to it, but it needs context. Early in the war, when the Mustang was still using the Allison engine and was restricted to low-altitude work, German pilots didn't really take it seriously as a threat. It was a good ground attack plane, but it wasn't going to challenge the 109s and 190s at high altitude, where the real air superiority fight was happening. The Germans had good reason to feel confident. They had excellent aircraft, experienced pilots, and a defensive system that was chewing up American bombers at an unsustainable rate. But that changed fast once the Merlin-powered Mustangs arrived. There's a story, and I can't verify this 100%, but it's been told by a number of historians, about a German pilot who saw P-51s for the first time deep inside German territory and couldn't believe it. He thought they must be captured aircraft or some kind of trick. The Germans knew the range limitations of American fighters. They'd based their entire defensive strategy around those limitations. And suddenly, the rules had changed. German pilots who survived the war and wrote memoirs or gave interviews later described the P-51 with a lot of respect, sometimes grudging respect, but respect nonetheless. It was fast, it could turn well, it had good visibility from the cockpit, and it seemed to be everywhere. The psychological impact shouldn't be underestimated either. Imagine you're a German fighter pilot in early 1944. You've been holding your own against the American bombers, taking losses but inflicting worse, and you believe you're winning. Then one day you're scrambling to intercept a bomber formation over central Germany, and you look up and see dozens of American fighters, not turning back, not running low on fuel, but coming right at you with plenty of fight left. That changes everything. The spring of 1944 was particularly brutal for the Luftwaffe. The Allies launched what they called Big Week, a concentrated series of bombing raids in February 1944 designed to destroy the German aircraft industry. The P-51s and P-47s flew escort, and the air battles were intense. The Americans lost bombers, quite a few actually, but the Luftwaffe lost fighters and pilots at a rate they couldn't sustain. Some historians estimate that the Luftwaffe lost more than 1,000 aircraft in that single week, either in combat or in attacks on airfields and factories. Even more importantly, they lost experienced pilots, the kind of pilots who took years to train and who couldn't be easily replaced. By the time of D-Day in June 1944, the Allies had achieved air superiority over Western Europe. That didn't mean there were no German planes in the sky. There were, and they still posed a threat. But the Allies could operate without fear of major interference. The invasion beaches were covered by an umbrella of fighters, and any German aircraft that tried to attack the invasion fleet had to run a gauntlet of Mustangs and Thunderbolts. On D-Day itself, the Luftwaffe flew only about 100 sorties over the beaches, compared to almost 15,000 by Allied aircraft. The balance had shifted completely. The P-51 continued to dominate for the rest of the war. Even when the Germans introduced new aircraft, like the Me-262 jet fighter, the Mustang found ways to counter them. The 262 was faster than anything with a propeller, but it was vulnerable during takeoff and landing when it was slow and couldn't maneuver. So P-51 pilots learned to patrol near German airfields and catch the jets at their most vulnerable. It was dangerous work because the airfields were heavily defended by flak, but it was effective. Let me talk for a minute about why the P-51 was so good. Because it wasn't magic. It was engineering. The laminar flow wing I mentioned earlier was a big part of it. Traditional airfoils create lift by having a curved upper surface and a flatter lower surface, which creates different air pressures. But they also create a lot of drag because the airflow over the wing tends to become turbulent. The P-51's wing was designed to keep the airflow smooth, or laminar, over a larger portion of the wing surface, which reduced drag and improved speed and fuel efficiency. It sounds simple when I explain it like that, but it was actually quite innovative for its time, and it took a lot of careful engineering to make it work. The radiator design was another clever feature. On most aircraft, the radiator that cools the engine is a big source of drag, because it sticks out into the airflow. The P-51 had its radiator mounted in a duct underneath the fuselage, and the way the air flowed through that duct actually provided a small amount of thrust, partially offsetting the drag. It's called the Meredith effect, named after the British engineer who figured out the principle. The net result was that the P-51 was faster and more fuel efficient than it would have been with a conventional radiator installation. And then there was the Merlin engine, which I've mentioned several times because it really was the key to the whole thing. The Merlin was already one of the best piston engines in the world, refined through years of development and combat experience with the British. It had a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that maintained performance at high altitude, which is exactly what the Mustang needed to escort bombers at 25,000 feet and above. Packard built the American version under license, and they maintained the same quality standards, so the engines were reliable and powerful. Now, I don't want to give the impression that the P-51 was perfect, because no aircraft is. It had vulnerabilities. The cooling system was one of them. The liquid-cooled Merlin engine depended on that radiator to function, and if the radiator took a hit, you were in trouble. One bullet in the wrong place and you'd lose all your coolant, and then you had maybe 5 minutes before the engine seized up. Air-cooled engines like the one in the P-47 were more tolerant of battle damage. Some pilots felt the P-51's cockpit was cramped, or that the visibility through the framed canopy on early models wasn't as good as it could be. The later P-51D addressed that with the famous bubble canopy, which gave almost 360 degrees of visibility, but those earlier versions had limitations. There were also concerns about the P-51's performance in certain flight regimes. It could get into compressibility issues in high-speed dives, where the airflow over the wings approached the speed of sound and caused control problems. Several pilots were lost to this before the problem was fully understood. And while the Mustang was a good dogfighter, it wasn't necessarily the best in a slow, turning fight. The Spitfire could outturn it. So could the Japanese Zero, though that's a different theater. P-51 pilots learned to fight to the aircraft's strengths, using speed and energy rather than getting into slow, circling fights where they could be at a disadvantage. But these were minor issues in the grand scheme of things. The P-51 did what it was designed to do better than any other aircraft of its time, which was to escort heavy bombers deep into enemy territory and fight off enemy interceptors. And by doing that, it changed the course of the air war. Let me give you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about. By the end of the war, the 8th Air Force, which was the main American strategic bombing force in Europe, had dropped more than 600,000 tons of bombs on Germany. That's an almost incomprehensible amount of explosive. The bomber crews suffered enormously, with more than 26,000 killed and thousands more wounded or captured. But the bombing campaign, protected by those P-51 escorts, did real damage to Germany's ability to wage war. Oil production was hit particularly hard, which affected everything from tank operations to pilot training. Aircraft factories were bombed repeatedly, and while the Germans got good at dispersing production and rebuilding, they could never completely compensate for the damage. The human cost on the German side was enormous too. The Luftwaffe lost tens of thousands of pilots over the course of the war, and by 1945, the average experience level of German fighter pilots had dropped drastically. New pilots were being sent into combat with sometimes less than 100 hours of flight time, facing American and British pilots with hundreds of hours and extensive combat experience. It was a mismatch that could only end one way. There's a tendency in some histories to portray the P-51 as this wonder weapon that single-handedly won the air war, and I want to push back against that a little bit because it's not quite that simple. The P-47 Thunderbolt also deserves enormous credit. It flew more sorties than any other American fighter in Europe. It shot down a lot of enemy aircraft, and it excelled at ground attack work. The P-38 Lightning played a crucial role in the Pacific, and also contributed in Europe and the Mediterranean. British aircraft, the Spitfire and the Typhoon and the Mosquito, were essential to the combined Allied air offensive. And ultimately, it was the combined weight of all these forces, plus the Soviet air forces on the Eastern Front, that destroyed the Luftwaffe. But the P-51 filled a gap that nothing else could fill. Before it arrived with the Merlin engine, the American bomber offensive was on the verge of failing. After it arrived, the Allies steadily gained air superiority, until by D-Day, the Luftwaffe was largely a spent force. That transformation happened in a matter of months, from late 1943 to mid-1944, and the P-51 was at the center of it. I think there's also a human element to this story that's worth appreciating. The men who flew these missions, on both sides, honestly, were doing something incredibly dangerous. The attrition rates were staggering. A fighter pilot in the 8th Air Force had about a 50-50 chance of completing his tour without being killed, wounded, or captured. Those aren't great odds. And yet, they kept flying, mission after mission, because they believed in what they were doing, or because they felt a duty to their country, or because they couldn't let down the other men in their unit. That kind of courage is worth remembering, regardless of which side someone was on. The P-51 Mustang remained in service long after World War II ended. It flew in Korea, where it served as a ground attack aircraft because the jets had taken over the air superiority role. Many were sold to other countries, where they served for decades. And of course, a lot of them ended up in private hands, restored and maintained by enthusiasts who appreciate what these aircraft represent. If you've ever been to an air show and seen a Mustang fly, you know the sound, that distinctive growl of the Merlin engine. It's a sound that takes people back 70, 80 years to a time when the outcome of the war hung in the balance and young men in their early 20s were flying into combat over the skies of Europe. The legacy of the P-51 goes beyond just the statistics and the victories. It represents a moment when American industry, engineering, and courage came together to solve a critical problem. The bomber offensive was failing. The losses were unsustainable. And the solution was this airplane, designed in 102 days by a company that was relatively unknown, transformed by a British engine, and flown by pilots who pushed themselves and their machines to the absolute limit. That's a story that says something about what people can accomplish when they have to. There's one more thing I want to mention before we wrap up, and that's about the relationship between the bomber crews and the fighter pilots. For a long time, there was some tension there. The bomber crews felt like the fighters weren't doing enough to protect them, that they were off chasing glory while the bombers got shot to pieces. And the fighter pilots sometimes looked down on the bomber crews, or felt that their contributions weren't appreciated. But as the war went on, and especially after the P-51s started providing real, effective escort, a genuine respect developed. Bomber crews would watch for those little fighters, learn to recognize them by their markings, and feel a sense of relief when they saw them. The fighter pilots, for their part, came to understand just how tough the bomber crews had it, sitting in those formations, unable to maneuver, just absorbing punishment and hoping they made it through. After the war, many of these men stayed in touch. They formed veterans organizations, held reunions, wrote memoirs. Their stories have been preserved, and that's important because living memory fades. The World War II generation is almost gone now. The youngest veterans are in their late 90s. Soon, there won't be anyone left who actually flew those missions, who actually experienced what it was like. All we'll have are the records, the histories, and the aircraft themselves, preserved in museums and collections, silent witnesses to what happened. The story of the P-51 Mustang is, in a lot of ways, a story about adaptation and innovation. The Americans started with a theory about daylight precision bombing, and when that theory ran into harsh reality, they adapted. They found a solution in an aircraft that almost never existed, that was designed for a different purpose, that needed an engine from another country to reach its potential. And then they produced that aircraft in the thousands, trained pilots to fly it, and sent them into combat to fight for air superiority over Europe. It wasn't pretty. A lot of men died. But it worked, and by the summer of 1944, the Allies owned the skies. So when you hear that number, 5,000 German planes shot down by P-51 Mustangs, try to think about what that actually means. 5,000 aircraft, each one flown by a man who was somebody's son, somebody's brother, somebody's husband. The air war was brutal on both sides, and both sides lost irreplaceable people. But the outcome mattered. It mattered to the men in the bombers who were able to complete their missions and come home. It mattered to the soldiers on the ground who weren't strafed by German aircraft on D-Day. It mattered to the prisoners in the concentration camps who were liberated because the war ended sooner rather than later. History is complicated, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but some things genuinely mattered, and this was one of them. The P-51 Mustang didn't win the war by itself. No single weapon ever does, but it solved a problem that had to be solved for the Allied strategy to work, and it did so with a combination of engineering excellence and human courage that deserves to be remembered. The German pilots who laughed at the early Mustangs learned to respect and fear the later ones. Adolf Galland and other Luftwaffe commanders recognized that the appearance of American fighters over Berlin meant the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. And the men who flew those Mustangs, from famous aces like George Preddy and Don Gentile to the countless pilots whose names aren't widely known, they accomplished something extraordinary. All right, folks, before I let you go, I just want to take a moment to reflect on what we've talked about today. You know, we hear a lot of numbers when we study history: casualty figures, production numbers, sortie counts, and sometimes those numbers can feel abstract, like they're just statistics. But behind every one of those numbers was a human being, someone who was scared and brave at the same time, who wrote letters home and wondered if they'd make it back, who did their duty even when the odds looked impossible. The pilots who flew the P-51 Mustang weren't superheroes, they were regular Americans, kids from Ohio and California and North Carolina and everywhere else, who stepped up when their country needed them. And the people who designed and built those aircraft, who figured out how to make them faster and fly farther, they were regular Americans too, engineers and factory workers who knew that the work they were doing mattered. That's the kind of story I think is worth telling, not because it glorifies war, because war is terrible, but because it shows what ordinary people can do when they commit themselves to something bigger than themselves. These are the stories that remind us who we are and where we came from. And as long as there are still people who want to remember, I think we ought to keep telling them. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the next one.